Hey everyone, it's Richard here, just doing a little video for the channel. So I'm just going to sit here and waffle at you for a bit, and if you manage to make it through to the end, well, congratulations. You'll be doing better than I did the first time, because I recorded about 5 minutes and realised I hadn't turned my mic on. So, you know, skills. And yeah, so I just had some thoughts I wanted to put out there. You know, I even got as far as to make some notes, which, if you know how lazy I am, you know how big a deal that is. But yeah, there's just been a lot of discussion and talk about the health of the game, the meta, that sort of things, where the game is currently. And I just wanted to put my 2 pennies worth out there. So one of the things that sort of prompted me was I read Andrew Holder's article about Blitz on coping with cardboard. So I'd recommend you go and read that. If you want to take a moment, go read it now and then come back, feel free. But yeah, so the sort of gist of his article was that Blitz was sort of removing agency from the game, in terms of the game being sort of a conversation between 2 players, the back and forth, and Blitz sort of removing that and putting it all sort of up front on the offensive player, and they get multiple things to do, and then only then does the opponent then get to interact. And I agree, but I think it's sort of even just more than just Blitz and everything, because the game is sort of less of a conversation and more of a debate between the players, right? You're not sort of talking about a thing you're both necessarily interested in. You're both trying to almost like get your point of view over, like, you know, I should be winning this game, or I think I should be winning this game, or I want this attack to be hitting you. I don't want this attack to hit me. I want to block it, or I don't want to take any damage, blah, blah, blah. Right? So in a debate, is, you know, usually you'd have that sort of back and forth. If I put my point through, you put your counter to it through, and so on and so forth. And that's a lot how that sort of enhanced step and things work in the game, or has been in sort of historically. There's that sort of punch and counter punch to it. And Blitz certainly, I think, detracts from that in the way Andrew describes, in terms of like having all that sort of upfront, that sort of front loading of the attack and what the attacker is getting to do. I mean, aside from that, I think Blitz doesn't really necessarily achieve what it's set out to do, but that's a separate story. There's been a lot of like dissenting voices, I'd say, in the community. So people generally voicing their dissatisfaction with the cards, with the meta, with, you know, how things are shaken out, and people sort of quitting the game because they're not enjoying it. But then there's also been other people that are generally more positive and thinking, and, you know, talking about how there's lots of different strategies in the game, right? You know, there's maybe 10 different top decks or what have you, and, you know, they all necessarily doing different things. So that sort of on its face maybe looks healthy when you look at things sort of like that sort of competitive lens, right? And I don't necessarily agree with that. Part of that, I guess, twofold, right? So, and I guess they're similar. And I'll refer back to sort of another sort of view on that, is that, so I used to play Magic. I don't anymore. But I do like to sort of sometimes listen to Magic content. And one of the ones I quite often listen to is Limited Resources. So this is a podcast about Magic Limited play by Marshall Sutcliffe, who's one of the sort of premier people that Magic have on their coverage team, and Luis Scott Vargas, who is, I think, generally regarded as like top 5 ever to play the game in terms of pros. I don't know where he would generally sit, but most people probably have him in the top 5. And I think it was the Strixhaven as a set they were talking about. So usually when you have a limited set, they have a certain number of like color pairs or strategies that are viable within the set, or in theory are, right? Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 10. And on the surface, what you might want is for all of those different strategies, all of those different color pairs to be viable, right? So all of them are evenly balanced, and so that you can sort of draft anything. And I think Luis sort of put forward that while Strixhaven wasn't balanced, like I think there were 5 main color pairs, and 2 or 3 of them were just mostly unplayable. And there was actually only 2 or 3 really competitive level decks within that. But actually, he really enjoyed the format because balance and diversity doesn't necessarily equal fun. And his take was actually, although some of these pairings were less powerful, actually there was enough depth in a lot of them that the format was just fun to play. Like the games, the cards, the interactions, they were just fun. So the sort of balance and diversity doesn't necessarily have to equal fun, and they are not necessarily a requirement for fun to be a thing. And being equally balanced also doesn't necessarily mean it's instantly fun. And I think we're sort of that's a bit of what we've got, in that we do have all these strategies. So if we look at some of the sort of top decks in the format, so things like the sort of Zeke Falling Titans type decks, Pony, Godzilla, Deku, like the equipment heist sort of decks. There's probably others I'm forgetting about. But the issue with these strategies, and there's a lot of them, when we take it back to the sort of viewing things as this sort of conversation debate, is these are strategies that just sort of shouting at each other, right? They're not necessarily interacting. They're more just dominating that conversation. They're dominating that side of the debate and saying, no matter what you're doing, I'm not interacting with it. I'm just going to overpower it, right? I don't care. Or I've got enough that it doesn't matter what your side of the conversation is. I'm going to counteract that and then just win. I think that leads to the feeling about the format of it just not being fun. And a lot of these strategies are just not fun to play with or have that conversation with. We got like, I don't know if I mentioned Godzilla in that list, but again, no, I want it in that list of, some of these things, they're not necessarily too powerful, right? And you can interact with them, they're not necessarily fun to play against or fun to lose against. So when they do their thing, it's just like you feel like you didn't have agency, you didn't have a voice in that conversation. Godzilla just says, I'm going to play my blue card and then 5 orange cards. And sure, you might be able to interact with a couple of them, but it just doesn't matter. And then they don't try to interact with you on your side of the conversation and say, well, you're probably not going to do enough, and I'll just kill you again afterwards. Or maybe block one. And so they feel like a lot of these strategies are feeling at those times where, back in set 1, we had like a Tokiyami or a Jiro just playing at you. And a lot of that, I think, is what's going on. And the feelings people are having is just people playing at you. And I think part of the reason for that is Blitz, but also I think Attuned has a part to play in this. So because of the way Attuned works, while you have then more choice in terms of what you play, because you're sort of not symbol locked, because you can sort of pick and choose, you just end up with a lot more streamlined decks. There's sort of less room. Although you've got more choice, there's less room for your sort of pet cards or your tech pieces, because why would I play these when I can just play the good ones, right? So all these decks just get streamlined down to sort of their more oppressive and linear sort of versions. And I think and because everyone's playing these sort of where everything is more hyper focused, there feels less room when you're deck building to sort of get away with playing the cool ones and playing the interesting ones. So it sort of removes a bit of fun from that deck building puzzle. And because Attuned sort of almost forces design into building 2 symbol characters, because having 3 symbols means you've just got more choice, therefore the power level ratchets up even more. There's then less flavors of those characters, right? So, and again, they tend to get sort of pigeonholed into one of their symbols. You won't really necessarily, or you'll very rarely get situations where characters are performing on different sort of primary symbols. So like take the sort of where we had the UK regional, we had Bakugo 4 who performed really well on two of his symbols. I know we had two Zeke decks on two different symbols, so Karen Broberg and I think Calvin on, I think it was Life and Chaos. I can't remember exactly, but I think it just happens more rarely now. I think more characters just have an obvious symbol rather than them having. But again, that's sort of a separate thing. But I think that two symbol thing is just a bit of a cost of doing business with Attuned. But I think a lot of this just sort of comes down to vibes, right? And I appreciate the cringeness of a 43-year-old man talking about vibes, but I think that's what it is. Personally, again, if you look at these top decks, like the Zeke decks, Pony, Godzilla, Deku, your sort of Hawks, Equipment Heisty, Massive Mutant Machiney type things, like none of these they're not necessarily too overpowered, right? Yes, there are answers to them, but I think they don't feel necessarily good to lose against. They're not necessarily fun experiences to play the game with. Similar to how sometimes you would just sit down and someone would flip out a Tokiyami and you'd be like, cool, I'm just going to get turn 2. They're going to go orange card, blue card, orange card, blue card. I'm going to die. And it's like, well, I just have to hope they whiff. And sometimes they did. But again, they weren't necessarily fun games to play against. Whereas there was a lot of diversity in the meta where, you could fight against the Tokiyamis and, they would feel like a good game to play against. I mean, it might be rose-tinted glasses for like these old formats before we had entered sort of the Attuned and Blitz world. I don't know, but I think a lot of it, certainly for myself and other people I've spoken to locally, is it just the vibes fell off. Like they don't feel good. These decks don't necessarily feel good to be playing against or watching. But part of that is just the lens you're looking at things through, right? So I've mostly talked about all of this is when you look at the game through the lens of sort of top level competitive play, regionals, right? So, when my locals are watching the regionals happening, or I'm watching regionals happening on stream and looking at the results, they just like see Godzilla's doing their thing, or Zeke's doing their thing, or Ponies, and they're just like, oh my God, cringe. And it puts them off wanting to interact with the game, whereas our locals aren't like that, right? And I sort of come around to that of actually, you know what they're doing at regionals sort of doesn't matter, because I'm still going to just play cool shit and have fun. And I found that sort of almost trying to forget about that top level stuff, forgetting about the sort of competitive side of play has sort of made me fall a bit back more in love with the game again. Because our locals don't really play that stuff. Like I'm probably the sweatier one. Actually, it's probably more one of our other guys more sweaty, but like, we had our store scrambles at Shishiwakamaru one, and I was probably the sweatiest playing Donatello. And we just had fun. And I think if you can take a step back and forget about, the Godzillas, the Zekes, the Ponies of this world, and actually just put some fun stuff together and jam, the game's still as good as it's ever been. Sure, I'm not a fan of Blitz. I'm not a fan of Attuned. I would get rid of both of them given my choice, but that's the world we live in. But I think you can still have, the conversation of the game at our locals. And I think maybe that doesn't suit all locals. Maybe you have a very competitive one. You are all sort of the grinders, and you have a very competitive locals. You're all testing for regionals. You're trying to make yourself to worlds and all that and stuff. And I guess I feel for you in terms of the way that the game looks through that lens, right? Because that's the sort of choice you made. And, I don't fault anyone for doing that or wanting to do that, right? But that's just not where I am. And I think, there's plenty of room for just playing cool shit at locals. The game is certainly, I think, suffering at that competitive level because you have all of these strategies that are just shouting at each other. They're not trying to interact. They're not trying to have a conversation. And the ones that are just sort of getting pushed out, right? You know, Rodan's still a cracked character, and yes, he does sometimes perform, but sometimes he just falls flat into someone just shouting at him, right? And sometimes, you know, there's a rock, paper, scissors where some of these decks are better at shouting at the other ones than the other. But they're not necessarily because they're trying to counter it, right? I don't know what the answer is. I mean, sure, get rid of Blitz, maybe have things a bit more interactable. But I think it's that with the attuned stuff of decks just being a bit too streamlined, a bit too forthright in their opinions in terms of how the games are going to go. That, yeah, it's just, I think that at that competitive level, the vibes are sort of off a bit, right? There's still room always for sort of innovation and people coming out of the woodwork, but a lot of the time you see that in the hands of those top players who could probably top deck with a, or, you know, top of the tournament with a ham sandwich, right? There's less room for those road decks, I think, to find a space in the meta. There's less room to attack stuff in that way. There's less room for just people to play well into the face of some of these strategies that are just ignoring what you're doing and shouting at you. But yeah, I mean, again, if you're finding that, you know, looking at the top list and thinking about what am I going to do at the regionals, maybe don't. Maybe just go to locals and jam some cool shit and have fun, man. And if that's not a world that you can look at a CCG through, if, you know, that competitive juice is what you need from a game to love it, to play it, I get it. And maybe there is a reason then to step away, because at the top level competitive, it doesn't look fun. It doesn't. These things aren't necessarily fun to be playing into or playing with. But if you don't need that, just play some cool shit at locals and encourage your locals to do that, because again, the game's still a lot of fun. You can still do that shit. You can just ignore the results from regionals and just, you know, turn up with a Genkai or an Allura or, you know, anyone, you know, cool new Turtles character like a Splinter or something, and just jam some fun cards and have a fun game with your opponents and have that conversation. They're still capable, but yeah, when it starts getting to the top, that's when things fall apart a bit. And that's always been a bit of the case with Universus, right? It's always been a much better tabletop game than kitchen table game, I should say, than it has been a sort of hyper competitive game. It's always been the case. But anywho's, that's my my waffle done. Probably wrong, might be right, who knows? Obviously, let me know if I am. Let me know if you agree. Let me know if you disagree. Feel free. And otherwise, I'll catch you at the kitchen table. See you later.